Hey everyone, I just saw a comment on Facebook that I could I could talk for a while about this, and so I wanted to, instead of just trying to respond to that, I wanted to talk about this in a live stream because this is actually a really super common misunderstanding, and I think this is a communication problem more than anything. Um, Although it could certainly be, I guess it could be that some vets don't understand how this works. But then that is that the person said that they've been told by vets that in their area that worms are resistant to a lot of the dewormers in their area. And I hear this a lot. So that's why I want to do this live stream about it, so that in the future we can just share a link to this when somebody says this, because the really short answer to this is worms do not crawl from farm to farm. It is impossible for you to have a problem with dewormer resistance in a geographic area. You could have a problem with dewormer resistance, and the farm across the road from you would have no problem with dewormer resistance, because it's all about the management on your farm. So the only way for dewormer resistance to get on your farm is for you to bring it in another goat. That's it. So when you go to buy goats, you need to be asking people, what are their deworming practices? And you need to get super specific. One of my Goats 365 members, we had one of our meetings a couple months ago, and he was saying, and he'd been reading my stuff before he bought the goats. And so he asked, about this woman's deworming practices. And she said, oh, I only deworm when I need to. And she pretty much, like, he showed me her text, and she just totally, it sounded like, oh my God, this woman's totally clued in. She really understands, because she talked about using dewormers when they don't need it leads to dewormer resistance. And I check FOMACHA scores, and I check body condition and all the stuff. She said all the right things. But then this goat comes to his farm and is having a worm problem. And I said, you need to ask the person at the previous farm what dewormers she was using. And he got this copy of this health sheet from this woman. And she had been deworming that goat every single month. The only time she had not dewormed that goat was something like December and January. Otherwise, she had been doing it every single month. For whatever reason, she didn't understand what body condition should be, or what FOMACHA should be, or whatever. She was giving a dewormer every month. And so I was like, oh my God, you really just brought in a problem. So that's why you have to get really specific with people, because he brought in a goat that had a problem with dewormer resistance, because the breeder had been incorrectly using dewormers. So it was a doe in milk with 2 kids. So luckily, those 2 kids had only been given a dewormer once. And I don't know how badly resistant the worms were on this lady's farm, but hopefully those kids are pooping worms in the poop in the pasture that has eggs from worms that are not as resistant as the eggs that doe is pooping in the pasture. Because being given a dewormer this every month for almost her whole 3 years of life meant that particular dewormer was not going to work. And the lady had been using 2. And so you have to really start, it gets more complicated once you bring in an animal like that. And unfortunately, these were his first 3 goats. If you bring in one animal that's resistant and you have a lot of goats, then it's not as bad, because that one goat is going to be pooping the eggs that have the dewormer resistant eggs that are being hatched. but your other goats hopefully are not. So we've got all kinds of great information for you in our podcast. Just last month, I talked to Dr. Posado. We did a really long episode. I think it's like 45 minutes on common myths, because a couple months ago on Facebook, I discovered that there are still some really, really common myths that people feel very strongly are true, which they're not. Again, it's just like misunderstanding how this all works. And so check out For the Love of Goats podcast and for that episode. And then we've also got the one with Susan Shaney a year or two ago, where we talk about proper use of dewormers so that you don't wind up with dewormer resistance. So, if a vet in your area, if a vet says that they see a lot of dewormer resistance in the area, that doesn't mean that you're going to have dewormer resistance. That means that there are people in your area who don't know how to prevent dewormer resistance, and they're using dewormers incorrectly. Maybe they're using them incorrectly because this vet told them to use them in a way that's incorrect and that's going to create dewormer resistance. But I felt really bad because this guy sounds really sad and hopeless, like it's a losing battle. And it's not at all. In fact, the way I accidentally became a goat expert is that, back in the early 2000s, for the first 5 years we had goats, we did all the things wrong, because back then everybody did. And we did wind up with legit dewormer resistance in all of our, on our farm. There's no such thing as ending up in all your goats, because dewormer resistance does not happen in the goat. It happens in the worms, and then it winds up being on your farm. Some goats are more resilient than others, and so they can handle that better. Some of them are even more resistant, so they're not even going to get a high parasite load. I learned all of this stuff because I started actually reading the research that was being done back then, which was really still in its infancy. We've got so much research now that shows that not only is it possible to prevent dewormer resistance, it's possible to overcome it like we did. And it's also, in reality, you shouldn't be using dewormers. Like, dewormers are not ever your first line of defense for controlling worms. It is all about management, and management is free. So, I never use up a dewormer now before it expires, because typically I might have 1 or 2 does a year that needs it after kidding. And that's usually only if we breed a first freshener as a yearling, because they're still growing. They've got a lot of demands on their body. And so it's hard for them to put their energy into growing babies, making milk, feeding babies, growing themselves because they're still a yearling, and then also fighting off the parasites from the larvae that they're picking up in the pasture. So typically, I have lots of goats on my farm that have never had a dewormer in their lives now, and that's a huge turnaround from back in the early 2000s, even up to like 2008, 2009, just standing there watching goats die because the worms were resistant to all the dewormers. So anyway, that's why I'm so passionate about this. And I don't want anybody to feel hopeless about the parasite situation in their area, because it's not about your area. It's about what you're doing on your farm. And you have complete control over what happens on your farm. So you can do all the things right, even if everybody else in your area is doing all the things wrong. And you don't have to be losing all your goats to worms like I did back, 15 years ago. So I hope you have found this helpful. And please, if you've got any questions, post in the comments section below, and we will get back to you, either me or Tammy. And we're both certified FAMACHA instructors, so we're giving you the latest info. Take care. Bye.